People living in Japan, what are your stories about neckbeards that have visited your country? The vast majority will come over and geek out for a week in specific entertainment districts and tourist traps, which is pretty much live and let live for me. Some neckbeard do end up moving to Japan though, and they definitely exist in free on-board expat English teacher circles. That being said, there aren't really any stories that I know of that are particularly noteworthy. Most of them come here, go through culture shock and realize that Japan isn't all it was cracked up to be, and go home once they have had their fill. Some get stuck in bad marriages, have kids, and end up staying in low-paying English teaching jobs for the rest of their lives since they have no other marketable skills career options. And that lot is pretty sad. A small but notable percentage will break down because of the lack of a social support system, poor mental health care, which is always sad to see as well. Japan was an awesome place to live, but I don't know if I could stay there permanently. It would really depend on the job and location. The mentality is literally work all the time. There are people eligible to retire who don't retire because they feel society will look down on them if they do. The suicide rate is astronomical. There were a ton of perks to living there, but again, it would really depend on the situation if I was offered to go back permanently. Also, don't fall for the tourist traps if you're in Tokyo. There are better places for merchant games than Akihabara. Harajuku sucks, just avoid that one. And Shinjuku is fun, but a bit lacking and expensive compared to districts like Ueno. Even when I was visiting, I saw tourists really screw up the social etiquette, not in a bad way, but way too formal in everyday situations, not really following what the locals were doing. Things like very deep bows for completing a transaction at 7-11. So nothing bad, just funny to watch. Worked in Japan for just over a year. In that time the amount of white people I saw was close to zero, no surprise there, and rose to slightly more than zero when visiting foreigner tourist hotspots such as Shibuya or probably more notable well-known Akihabara. In my year there I didn't come across a single neckbeard. If by the term you mean willingly and groomed misogynist white pudding manchild, I think the worst I saw were anime manga enthusiasts that took the hobby quite serious going by what they were wearing. But honestly they weren't any worse than the natives. I am sure some true neckbeards do visit, but I reckon they are few and far between. Likely because getting to Japan is not cheap, staying in Japan is not cheap, living in Japan without social skills and the ability to be way outside of your comfort zone is not easy, so you need a steady disposable income, social skills, and the ability to get done that you are 100% unfamiliar with. Not really a skill set I associate with neckbeards. Furthermore, as a foreigner, you'd be hard pressed to adopt the hickey lifestyle, a lifestyle more in line with that of a typical neckbeard, of living in a tiny room on your own, eating rubbish, not socializing and being financially supported by family or online work. Oh, one other thing, maybe quite obvious, is the ability to speak Japanese or having a support network via friends, colleagues, company. Fantastic if you can follow your favorite daytime Japanese TV show. But that is going to help you close to 0% with filling out legal paperwork or understanding contracts. My company facilitated a lot in that regard, and my multilingual Japanese colleagues were a fantastic help. My amateur broken Japanese would not, and still is not, be enough to live there on my own, and I would never have gone in the first place had those things not been in place. Most of the comments on here already said it better than me. The tourist trap districts are what, as the name suggests, attract all of the tourists. The weebs neckbeards go to Akihabara. The fashion students go to Harajuku. Huge letdown, by the way, and the social media tourists flock to Shinjuku because of all the red light district places that were featured on BuzzFeed. I don't really have any stories about anyone in particular. I saw plenty of cringy tourists and people making fools of themselves, especially if it was for the sake of Instagram or YouTube. They'll take up the entire two-way sidewalk in those cases, but for the most part it was generally limited to those areas. You go to any real tourist destination in Japan and it will almost entirely consist of Japanese people. The country has a lot of wonderful places that are not really advertised to foreigners unless you dig for them. Some douchy British guy kept talking about all the women he's been with and calling women different slurs. Apparently he had been known for treating women like schwal in Japan. I was the only girl in the group and he said I was offended because I was American. My Japanese friends agreed that he was a douche. Not exactly a neckbird but a total creep all the same. I don't think many of them make it too far out of their mother's basement, let alone Japan. I lived in Osaka for 4 years, and at the end I only hung around foreigners, but I didn't meet too many neckbeards. The worst experience with a tourist wasn't a neckbeard per se, but a man obsessed with Japan and especially Japanese women. It was around my 24th birthday, and I was showing my friend visiting from home how weird Tinder can be in Japan. Found someone whose pictures were that weird anime girl costume. Well, I swiped right on this American guy cause he kinda looked like a douche, and I was right. A few messages in he started pestering me to meet up at his hotel. I kept saying no, but he kept at it, while saying things like how he'd rather be with a Japanese girl, and how he hooked up with one 30 minutes earlier. I told him sure, I'd meet up, but I never went. A week later I got an email from the Hyogo police asking about a guy whose name was similar, but different to the a-hole. I looked it up, and it turns out he murdered and threw his Japanese Tinder date's body in the woods. The names were different, but I'm 99% sure it's him because of the photos. If I remember correctly, he was found with her head in a bag or box on his person. I have his Tinder pictures on my old phone. Hell, I even saved the conversation. I went on a 2-week vacation to Japan a few years ago. Obviously I visited the hotspots like Akihabara and Harajuku. I didn't really see anyone that fit the traditional white neckbeard description, but one of the top recommendations on TripAdvisor was a maid cafe in Akihabara, so we decided to check it out. We weren't the only tourists there. There was another American couple that looked just as weirded out as we were. The place had no windows. The food was terrible and overpriced, and the maids honestly didn't spend much time around us. The creepy thing was that the place was filled with creepy looking, much older men that looked like they hung out there all day. At one point we saw one of them go into a back room with one of the maids for quite a while. Apparently if you bought an $80 bottle of wine you could cuddle with one of the maids. I don't know how old these girls were, but I got the impression that they were high school students. There's actually more Japanese neckbeards than foreign ones. From my experiences there, it's not unusual to see some greasy Japanese dude walk out of a shop with a bunch of lowly hentai he purchased in Akihabara. There's a large variety of anime and video game stores there, and there's no limit to the number of neckbeards you'll see. You'll often see foreign folks posing at the entrance to the JR station for pictures, but otherwise that's about it. When my California friend was visiting, who is a super neckbeard anime collector, I took him to a maid cafe and almost died laughing as they dressed up this former US Marine in cat apparel for a photoshoot with some of the maid employees. Me and my friends went to Tokyo in 2018 and I was genuinely shocked to see more than one white guy wearing a trench coat, fedora and fingerless gloves at the same time. All of them were in the multi-story arcades. I honestly didn't know people like that actually existed, let alone left their parents' basements to go as far as a different nation. I've known people who saw Japan as their utopia. They believe that what happens in manga and anime is real in Japan. They need help. As a note, liking anime and other similar things does not make someone a neckbeard. Here is the difference between neckbeards and non-neckbeards who both like anime, card games, video games, etc. A non-neckbeard will go to Akihabara to look at and buy a lot of anime stuff, but will also go to the varying other areas of Tokyo or other major cities in Japan. They will eat things that are normal there, but abnormal or completely unavailable at their home country, like pork ramen is easy to find in many countries. It's sukemen made with multiple seafoods and dried fish powder not so much. They will attempt to use Japanese for practical purposes in the correct context even if it might be wrong. A neckbeard would go to Akihabara to look at and buy a lot of anime stuff, but will probably never go outside of that area or their hotel room where they watch animes instead of going out. They will eat some Japanese stuff, but will probably hover around McDonald's and other Western foods because they don't want to try different Japanese food for some strange reason. The only Japanese they use are probably specific phrases from different animes to which they say in an exaggerated anime voice. What sucks is I do want to visit Japan but don't want to be judged as an American neckbeard. It seems like a really cool place to go though. Just shave your neck first, bro. That Japan really is 98.5% Japanese people. This is one of those things you can know in advance and understand in the abstract, yet still be surprised by it when you visit and see it in person. This was my experience. I wasn't quite expecting it. I felt I'd been misled. My wife is from Yokohama. I hadn't visited yet. We're both still in the US at the time, and she told me stories about Yokohama's past and present. Its unique historical status, a port city, more cosmopolitan, a city that even once had a segregated part of the city where foreigners were allowed to live. In the late 19th century, when Japan was first opening up to trade, and thereafter having a well-developed community of non-Japanese residents. For example, she used to babysit for the children of Western diplomats, learned to speak more advanced English earlier than her peers, which is part of how she ended up attending college in the US. Her description led me to understand Yokohama as having somewhat diverse population. Compared to other cities in Japan, I expected to see mostly Japanese, but expected to regularly see the faces of other Westerners. As I walked around the city, when I arrived, I didn't immediately see any evidence of this diverse population. I was in Japan for almost 2 weeks before I saw a single white face. It's all Japanese everywhere. I found it both thrilling and unsettling to be an extreme minority, surrounded by uniformly monocultural, monoracial people. I delighted in the fashions and styles worn by urban Yokohama residents. As I walked through train stations, businessmen in uniform, trench coats and hats, women with luxurious fabrics in tasteful combinations. People watching was invigorating and fun. Eventually we visited Chinatown, saw other Asian communities, and visited Tokyo. Saw British pubs, American hamburger joints, French bistros, and so on. We went to the Hard Rock Cafe, where I met many British, Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian folks, as well as a few Americans. I was relieved to have an opportunity to speak English, see a little pocket of expats, and then return to Yokohama.